Attention. Hands on the wheel. Don't move.
Officer, my wallet is in my back pocket. I'm gonna reach for it
Just
slowly.
keep your hands where I can see them.
The asphalt of Highway 84 shimmered under the oppressive weight of the Trinity County sun, a lazy river of black cutting through endless fields of sun-bleached grass. Inside the cool, controlled climate of a dark gray Chevrolet Tahoe, Deputy Sheriff Elijah Vance let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for the last 12 hours. The shift had been a grinder, a domestic dispute that bled into a property damage claim, followed by hours of tedious, soul-crushing paperwork. Now, all that stood between him and a cold drink on his back porch was 20 miles of straight, empty road. His off-duty attire was a uniform of anonymity, a simple gray hoodie pulled over a plain white t-shirt, worn-in jeans, and a pair of comfortable running shoes. It was the armor he wore to shed the skin of his job, to become just Elijah again, not Deputy Vance, second in command of the county's sheriff's department. He drove with one hand resting lightly on the wheel, the other tapping a rhythm against the center console. The Tahoe was his personal vehicle, not county-issued, but it was reliable, spacious, and most importantly, inconspicuous. In his line of work, blending in was a skill honed to a fine edge. The landscape rolled by in a hypnotic blur of green and gold. He knew this stretch of road by heart. Every curve, every faded billboard advertising cheap fireworks or a church revival, every lonely farmhouse set back 100 yards from the highway. This was his home. He was born and raised in Trinity County, had played high school football under the Friday night lights that were now just skeletal metal frames waiting for autumn. He'd left for a few years, college, then the academy, but the pull of this place, of its quiet, stubborn dignity, had brought him back. He was part of its fabric, sworn to protect it. He glanced at the digital clock on the dash. 3:17 p.m. His wife, Sarah, would be getting off her shift at the hospital soon. Maybe he'd surprise her, have dinner ready. The thought brought a small, tired smile to his face. He was so lost in the pleasant thought of a quiet evening, of the simple, peaceful life he worked so hard to preserve for others, that he almost didn't register the change in his rearview mirror. At first, it was just a white dot, rapidly growing larger. A Ford Interceptor, the model used by the city police in the neighboring jurisdiction of Northwood. They rarely patrolled this far out. Elijah's professional instincts, never truly dormant, flickered to life. He automatically checked his speed, 64 in a 65 zone. Perfectly legal. His registration was current, his insurance was in his glove box, and there were no warrants out for a 2022 gray Chevy Tahoe. He wasn't weaving or driving erratically. There was no logical reason for the patrol car to be closing the distance with such aggressive intent. It settled in behind him, uncomfortably close, tailgating with a purpose. He could see two figures inside, their faces obscured by the glare on their windshield. He kept his hand steady on the wheel, his breathing even. A dozen possibilities ran through his mind. Maybe they'd mistaken his vehicle for one involved in a call. Maybe it was a new pair of officers, unsure of the jurisdictional lines. He decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. He maintained his speed, his course steady, offering no reason for provocation. He was a lawman. He understood the rules of the road, both written and unwritten. The Interceptor hung there for a long, tense minute. It was a power play, a classic intimidation tactic. Elijah had seen rookies use it, trying to spook a driver into a mistake. He didn't bite. He simply drove, his eyes flicking between the road ahead and the mirror. He could feel the situation shifting, the air in his car suddenly thick with unspoken questions. He was no longer just a man driving home. He was a target. He didn't know why, but the cold certainty of it settled in his gut. Then, the world behind him exploded in a silent detonation of red and blue light. The strobes flashed erratically, painting the interior of his Tahoe in frantic, pulsing colors. There was no siren, just the jarring, aggressive lights demanding he submit. Elijah's tired smile from moments before was now a memory. He sighed, a quiet puff of air filled with a profound, weary frustration. It wasn't the stop that bothered him. It was the feeling that this stop wasn't about the law. It was about something else entirely. With the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had done this 1,000 times from the other side of the glass, he signaled, eased the heavy SUV onto the gravel shoulder, and shifted the gear into park. The engine ticked quietly in the sudden silence, the only sound besides the crunch of tires as the patrol car pulled in tightly behind him, pinning him in place. The afternoon sun was relentless, beating down on the roof of the Tahoe and turning the gravel shoulder into a hazy, shimmering expanse. Before Elijah's engine had fully settled, 2 doors of the Ford Interceptor slammed shut in quick, angry succession. The sound was sharp, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence he hadn't yet been allowed to read. In his side view mirror, he watched 2 Northwood police officers emerge, their movements stiff and purposeful. They were walking into a confrontation, not a conversation. The driver, a tall, wiry officer with a severe haircut and eyes that seemed permanently narrowed against the sun, moved toward the driver's side. His partner, broader and younger, with a face that was still learning how to arrange itself into an expression of authority, began to circle around toward the passenger side. Their uniforms were crisp, their boots polished, but their posture screamed aggression. Their hands hovered unnaturally close to their holsters, a gesture that was either a nervous habit or a deliberate threat. Elijah had seen it countless times. It was the posture of an officer who had already decided the man in the car was a danger. Elijah kept both of his hands visible, resting them on the top of the steering wheel in a universal sign of compliance. His training, drilled into him over 15 years, took over. De-escalate. Comply with lawful orders. Stay calm. The driver's side officer, whose name tag would later be identified as Calloway, stopped just behind the driver's door, staying in Elijah's blind spot. A tactical move designed to keep a driver off balance. The first words spoken were not a greeting, not a, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" but a barked command that cut through the quiet afternoon air. "Hands on the wheel! Don't move!" The voice was rough, laced with an immediate, unearned hostility. There was no preamble, no "sir," no professional courtesy. It was the tone one used for a cornered felon, not a citizen on a state highway. Elijah felt a familiar, bitter sting of frustration. This was wrong. Every part of this was a violation of standard procedure, a textbook example of a biased stop. He didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes forward, his hands locked on the wheel. "My hands are on the wheel, officer," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. He pitched it to be non-threatening but firm. He was not a suspect to be intimidated. Calloway stepped forward, his face finally visible in the side mirror. He was maybe 30, with a hard set to his jaw and a look of profound suspicion in his eyes. He peered into the SUV, his gaze sweeping over Elijah's plain clothes, the empty passenger seat, the gym bag in the back. His eyes seemed to be searching for something to validate the decision he'd already made. "License and registration," Calloway snapped, his tone unchanged. His partner, Officer Miller, was now at the passenger side window, his own flashlight out even in the bright daylight, peering inside with an exaggerated intensity. He was a mimic, adopting the aggressive posture of his senior partner. Elijah knew this was a critical moment. Any sudden movement could be misinterpreted, used as a pretext for escalation. "Officer, my wallet is in my back pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment," he stated calmly, narrating his intentions before acting. "I'm going to reach for them slowly." "Just keep your hands where I can see them," Calloway retorted, taking a half-step back, his hand now resting directly on the grip of his sidearm. The gesture was theatrical and completely unnecessary. Elijah moved with an almost painful slowness. He used his right hand to pull his wallet from his back pocket, never letting his left hand leave the steering wheel. He placed the wallet on the dashboard. Then he announced, "I am now reaching for the glove compartment." He leaned over, popped it open, and retrieved the folded insurance and registration papers. He placed them next to his wallet. Through it all, he could feel Miller's eyes on him from the other side, a heavy, judgmental weight. He looked back at Calloway, waiting. The officer just stared at him, his expression a mask of cold authority. He made no move to approach and take the documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" Elijah asked, his voice still level, betraying none of the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You haven't stated a reason for the stop." Calloway's lips curled into a faint sneer. "I'll ask the questions. You were driving in a manner that aroused suspicion." "Aroused suspicion?" Elijah repeated, the words tasting like ash. "I was driving 1 mile per hour under the speed limit in the right-hand lane. What part of that is suspicious?" The question, logical and direct, seemed to irritate Calloway. It was a challenge to the flimsy pretext for this entire encounter. Instead of answering, he shone his own high-lumen flashlight directly into Elijah's face, causing him to squint and turn away from the blinding, disorienting beam. It was another petty act of dominance, another way to assert control where none was warranted. In that blinding white light, Elijah understood with absolute clarity. This stop had nothing to do with his driving. It had to do with him. The flashlight beam was a physical assault, a needle of pure white light designed to disorient and intimidate. Elijah instinctively turned his head, his eyes squeezed shut against the glare. The afterimage of the bulb danced behind his eyelids like a malevolent star. The air in the Tahoe, once cool and comfortable, now felt suffocating, charged with a hostile energy. He was a decorated law enforcement officer, a man who commanded respect in his department. Yet here, on the side of a highway he'd known his whole life, he was being treated like a common criminal by officers half his age with a fraction of his experience. "Officer, there's no need for the light," Elijah said, his voice tight but controlled. He forced himself to open his eyes, blinking away the spots. "It's the middle of the afternoon." Calloway clicked the light off, but the aggression didn't recede. It simply changed form. "This your vehicle?" he asked, his tone clipped, accusatory. "Yes, it is," Elijah replied, keeping his answers short and direct. "Don't volunteer information. Don't give them anything to twist." "Where are you headed?" "Home." "Coming from where?" The questions were rapid fire, a standard interrogation technique meant to catch someone in a lie. "From my job." Calloway let out a short, skeptical laugh. It was a grating, unpleasant sound. "Oh, yeah? And what job would that be?" He leaned in closer to the window, his gaze sweeping over Elijah's hoodie and jeans again, as if the simple clothing were evidence of a crime. This was the moment. Elijah could tell them who he was. He could flash the credentials that would end this charade instantly. But something held him back. It was a stubborn knot of professional pride. He shouldn't have to. His identity as a law-abiding citizen should be the default assumption, not something he had to prove under duress. The uniform shouldn't be a shield he had to present to be treated with basic respect. More than that, he knew that revealing his rank now, in this superheated environment, could be seen as a challenge. It might make things worse before it made them better. He chose his words carefully. "I work for the county." From the other side of the vehicle, Miller scoffed audibly. "Right, the county. Doing what exactly? Mowing the lawns?" The dismissive remark was meant to provoke, to get a reaction. Elijah refused to give it to them. He met Calloway's gaze in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "I've provided my license and registration. They're on the dashboard. You haven't given me a lawful reason for this detention. If you believe I've committed a crime, you need to state it. Otherwise, I should be free to go." He was quoting basic constitutional law, the very principles these officers had sworn an oath to uphold. But Calloway looked at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. The officer's mind was a locked room, and the facts Elijah was presenting couldn't find a key. The assumptions had been made the moment he saw a black man in a nice SUV driving through this part of the county. The rest was just theater, a post facto justification for a decision rooted in prejudice. "We'll decide when you're free to go," Calloway said, his voice dropping. "We've had reports of a vehicle matching this description involved in recent burglaries in Northwood." It was a lie, a flimsy, transparent lie. Elijah knew it instantly. An officer citing a bolo, be on the lookout, would be specific. They would provide details about the make, model, year, and crucially, the license plate. A vehicle matching this description was a catch-all phrase, a shield of plausible deniability for a stop based on a hunch. "My plates are right there for you to run," Elijah said, his patience wearing thin as a thread. "You can verify in 30 seconds that this vehicle has no connection to any crime." Calloway ignored him. He seemed to be enjoying the power he held, the control he was exerting. He was acting out a script he had in his head, and Elijah's calm, logical responses were an unwelcome deviation. "A lot of expensive equipment in here," Miller commented from the passenger side, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. "GPS, nice stereo system. You buy all this on a county salary?" The insinuation was clear and ugly. Every object in his car was being recontextualized as stolen property. His personal belongings were being used as evidence against him in a trial that was happening only in the minds of these two officers. The wall of their assumptions was impenetrable. It was built of something far stronger than bricks and mortar. It was built of prejudice, and Elijah knew from bitter experience that logic was no match for it. He felt a cold dread creep into his gut. This wasn't just unprofessional, this was becoming dangerous. The air inside the Tahoe grew thick with a palpable sense of menace. The conversation had stalled, hitting the unyielding wall of Officer Calloway's prejudice. Elijah's calm, factual statements were having the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of de-escalating the situation, his refusal to be intimidated seemed to be angering Calloway, challenging the officer's fragile sense of authority. Elijah could see the subtle tightening of the muscles in Calloway's jaw, the slight flare of his nostrils. These were the telltale signs of a man whose ego was taking control, pushing training and protocol to the back seat. "I'm going to say this one more time," Calloway said, his voice low and laced with threat. "What is your job with the county?" Elijah weighed his options. The moment for quiet compliance was passing. The situation was escalating on a dangerous trajectory, and he needed to try and divert it. "My identification is in my wallet on the dashboard," he said, his tone still even but carrying a new weight of seriousness. "It will answer all your questions. May I present it to you?" "Don't touch anything," Calloway snapped. He exchanged a look with Miller over the roof of the SUV. It was a silent, conspiratorial glance that made the hairs on Elijah's arms stand up. They were confirming a shared narrative, reinforcing each other's biases. Miller gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. That was it. The decision was made. Calloway stepped back from the window, creating distance. His hand, which had been resting on his gun, now moved to unsnap the retention holster. The soft click of the button releasing was as loud as a gunshot in the tense silence. It was a deliberate, calculated act of intimidation. "All right, here's what's going to happen," Calloway announced, his voice taking on a formal, commanding tone that was completely at odds with the illegality of his actions. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Elijah's blood ran cold. This was a major escalation. An officer cannot order a driver out of a vehicle during a routine traffic stop without reasonable suspicion that a crime is afoot, or that the officer's safety is at risk. Calloway had neither. He had a hunch, a prejudice, and a desire to impose his will. "For what reason, officer?" Elijah asked, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. He had to create a record, to challenge the unlawful order, even if he knew the challenge would be ignored. "You have my license and registration available. You have not articulated any reasonable suspicion of a crime." "My reason," Calloway said, his eyes hard as stone, "is that I'm giving you a lawful order, and you're going to comply with it. Now." He moved to the driver's side door and placed his hand on the handle. Elijah knew he had reached a critical fork in the road. He could refuse, argue his constitutional rights, and risk the situation spiraling into a physical confrontation he might not win. Or he could comply, exit the vehicle, and hope that he could survive the encounter long enough for the truth to come out. His training, his experience, and his instinct for self-preservation all screamed the same answer. He let out a slow, controlled breath. "I am not resisting," he said clearly, for the benefit of any potential recording, for the record he was building in his own mind. "I am complying with your order under protest." He raised his hands slowly from the steering wheel, palms open and visible. "I am going to open the door now." He reached for the handle, his movements measured and deliberate. The sun-baked metal was hot to the touch. As he pushed the heavy door open, the sounds of the highway rushed in. The distant drone of an 18-wheeler, the chirp of unseen insects in the tall grass. The world outside the car felt strangely normal, a stark contrast to the surreal, dangerous bubble he was trapped in. Calloway stepped back to give him room, but his posture was coiled, like a predator waiting for its prey to make a false move. Miller had moved back as well, creating a crossfire position. They were treating him like a high-risk felony suspect. As Elijah swung his legs out and planted his feet on the gravel, the full heat of the afternoon hit him. The sun glared off the chrome of the patrol car, momentarily blinding him. He stood up slowly, keeping his hands raised and away from his body. He was exposed, vulnerable, and at the complete mercy of two officers who saw him not as a man, but as a threat they had invented in their own minds. Standing on the gravel shoulder, Elijah felt a profound sense of dislocation. The familiar highway, the warm air, the drone of cicadas, it was the backdrop to a nightmare. He stood with his hands slightly raised, a posture of surrender that chafed at his soul. He was taller than both officers, a fact that seemed to amplify their hostility. In their eyes, his height wasn't just a physical attribute, it was an additional threat. "Turn around! Face the vehicle!" Calloway commanded, his voice sharp. Elijah complied, turning his back to the officers. The act of turning his back on two armed men who had already demonstrated their instability sent a jolt of pure survival instinct through him. He fought it down. Panic was a contagion. Calm was a shield. He placed his hands flat on the hot roof of the Tahoe, the metal scorching through his thin hoodie. He spread his feet, assuming the position. He had put dozens of suspects in this very stance. To be on the receiving end was a deeply humbling, infuriating experience. He could hear the crunch of boots on gravel as Calloway approached. He braced himself for the pat-down. A hand roughly grabbed his shoulder. "What's in your pockets?" Calloway asked, his voice close to Elijah's ear. "My keys are in my front right pocket. My phone is in my front left. My wallet is on the dashboard where you told me to leave it," Elijah recited, his voice flat and emotionless. Calloway's hands were clumsy and unprofessional. It wasn't the methodical, systematic search of an officer looking for weapons. It was a rough, invasive rummaging. He slapped Elijah's sides, his legs, his back. He pulled the keys from Elijah's pocket, dangling them for a moment before tossing them onto the roof of the SUV with a clatter. He did the same with the phone. "Stay right there. Don't you even think about moving," Calloway warned, his voice a low growl. He then stepped back, leaving Elijah in the humiliating position of being spread-eagled against his own car. Meanwhile, Officer Miller, who had been watching with a nervous energy, seemed to take this as his cue. "I'm going to clear the vehicle," he announced, his voice lacking the conviction of his partners. "You do not have my consent to search my vehicle," Elijah stated firmly, his voice directed over his shoulder. It was a necessary legal declaration, one he knew they would ignore, but it had to be said. Accountability started with a clear record of dissent. "We don't need your consent," Calloway sneered from behind him. "We have probable cause. Your suspicious behavior and the reports of burglaries are more than enough." Another lie, built on the foundation of the first one. Probable cause required specific, articulable facts. All they had was a vague, unsubstantiated claim and a driver who didn't fit their picture of who should be behind the wheel of a new SUV. Elijah remained still, listening as Miller opened the passenger side door. The sounds were jarringly loud, the rustle of papers being thrown from the glove compartment onto the floor, the thump of the center console lid being slammed open, the zip of his gym bag being torn open in the back seat. Each sound was an act of violation, a desecration of his private space. His Tahoe was more than just a vehicle. It was an extension of his life, a carefully organized space that was now being ransacked by a man who had already judged and convicted him. He focused on his breathing, a technique he'd learned at the academy to stay centered in high-stress situations. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 4. The sun beat down on his neck. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. He could feel the eyes of passing drivers on him, their faces a mixture of curiosity and alarm as they slowed to gawk at the scene. He was a spectacle. A black man in a hoodie, hands on his car, being searched by 2 white cops. It was a tired, ugly tableau, a scene that had played out with tragic consequences too many times before. He was acutely aware that he was just one misunderstanding, one twitch, one wrong move away from becoming another statistic, another name in a headline. The search of his SUV was not a search. It was a desecration. From his position against the side of the vehicle, Elijah could hear the chaos unfolding inside. Officer Miller was moving with a reckless abandon, driven by the need to find something, anything, that would justify the escalating situation. There was a loud clatter as a metal travel mug, a gift from his daughter, was knocked from a cup holder and sent rolling across the floor. Papers rustled, old receipts, a to-do list Sarah had written for him, notes from a training seminar. They were the mundane artifacts of his life, now being treated as potential evidence of a crime he hadn't committed. "Anything?" Calloway called out, his voice betraying a hint of impatient expectation. He was still standing behind Elijah, a silent, menacing presence. "Still looking," Miller replied, his voice slightly breathless. "Lot of stuff in here." Elijah clenched his jaw, fighting back a wave of pure, hot anger. He had worked his entire career by the book. He believed in the system, in the principles of justice and due process. What was happening now was a mockery of everything he stood for. This wasn't policing. This was a shakedown, a fishing expedition fueled by prejudice. He heard the back door of the Tahoe being yanked open. Miller was now in the back seat area. There was the sound of zippers being aggressively undone. Elijah knew what was back there. His gym bag with a change of clothes, a well-worn baseball glove he used when playing catch with his son, and a tactical bag that held off-duty essentials. "Hey, what's this?" Miller's voice had a new edge to it, a note of discovery. "Got a big tactical bag back here. Radio charger, trauma kit. Looks real professional." Instead of this discovery causing a moment of reflection, of questioning their initial assumption, it had the opposite effect. In their biased narrative, this wasn't the gear of a prepared professional. It was the equipment of someone impersonating one, or worse. "See?" Calloway said, his voice dripping with vindication. He took a step closer to Elijah. "What's a county worker doing with a tactical trauma kit, huh? Planning on doing some high-stakes mowing?" The sarcasm was thick and insulting. Elijah refused to take the bait. He remained silent, his hands flat against the hot metal roof. Arguing would be pointless. They weren't listening to his words. They were listening to the story they had already written in their heads. The search grew more frantic. Miller moved to the rear cargo area. The sounds became louder, more destructive. A storage container was opened. Its contents, jumper cables, road flares, a toolkit, spilled onto the floor. Elijah felt each sound like a physical blow. He had meticulously organized that kit, a habit from years of wanting to be prepared for any roadside emergency. Now it was just a jumble, a mess created by a man on a mission to prove his own bigotry right. "Find anything with a serial number," Calloway instructed. "Something we can run." He was actively seeking to create a crime where none existed, hoping to find an item he could claim was stolen. This crossed a bright red line, moving from unprofessionalism into outright illegal conduct. They were no longer officers of the law. They were aggressors with badges, using the color of their authority to harass him. Elijah thought about the men and women he served with. He thought of Sergeant Davies, a man who judged competence by action, not appearance. He thought of Sheriff Brody, a man who had taken a chance on him years ago, promoting him through the ranks based on merit and dedication. What would they think if they could see this? The shame of it was a heavy weight on his shoulders. He wasn't just being personally violated. The uniform he so proudly represented, even when not wearing it, was being dishonored by the actions of these two officers from a neighboring town. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Every passing car felt like a witness to his humiliation. He could feel their stares, their quick judgments. He wondered what they saw. Did they see a man being unlawfully detained? Or did they see exactly what Calloway and Miller wanted them to see? A dangerous suspect being rightfully subdued. The ambiguity was its own form of violence. And in that moment, pressed against his car under the harsh afternoon sun, Elijah knew he had to do more than just endure this. He had to act. While Calloway stood guard and Miller continued his fruitless, destructive search, Elijah's mind was racing. His training wasn't just about physical defense or firearm proficiency. It was about tactical thinking, about finding a solution when trapped in a seemingly impossible situation. He was physically overpowered and at a tactical disadvantage. A direct challenge was out of the question. He needed a different kind of weapon. He needed the system itself. The car keys Calloway had carelessly tossed onto the roof lay just a few feet from his right hand. The key fob was a standard multi-button device: lock, unlock, trunk release, and a red panic button. But this wasn't a standard key fob. At his promotion to second-in-command, Sheriff Brody had given him a modified version. The panic button, when held for 5 seconds, did not trigger the car's audible alarm. Instead, it sent a silent, encrypted distress signal directly to the Trinity County Sheriff's Department dispatch, along with the vehicle's precise GPS coordinates. It was a last-resort safety feature, designed for situations where an officer was in covert danger, a hostage situation, an abduction, or a confrontation where making noise would be fatal. He had never used it. He never thought he would have to. The challenge was activating it without being seen. Calloway was standing just behind him, his attention divided between Elijah and Miller's search. It was a risk, a huge one. If Calloway saw the movement and misinterpreted it, the consequences could be catastrophic. Elijah took another slow, deep breath, feigning a sigh of exhaustion and resignation. "Look, officer," he said, his voice pitched to sound weary. "Can we just slow down here? There's no need to tear my car apart. Whatever you think you're going to find, it isn't there." He timed the words perfectly. As he spoke, drawing Calloway's focus to his voice, he shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that looked like someone getting tired of holding a stressful position. Under the cover of this small adjustment, he began to slide his right hand, millimeter by millimeter, across the hot, smooth surface of the roof toward the keys. His fingers were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Just stay quiet and keep your hands on the car," Calloway grunted, distracted for the exact second Elijah needed. His fingertips brushed against the cool metal of a key. He kept sliding, his touch light, until he felt the familiar plastic casing of the fob. He had to identify the correct button by feel alone. He knew its position, the round, concave button at the very bottom. His index finger found it. "I'm just saying this has gone on long enough," Elijah continued, keeping the verbal distraction going. He pressed the button. He couldn't look down to see the small LED that would confirm the signal was sent. He just had to trust the technology. He held the button down, counting silently in his head. 1 1,000, 2 1,000. He could feel Calloway's gaze on the back of his head, a burning, suspicious weight. 3 1,000. Miller slammed another compartment shut inside the car. 4 1,000. Come on. 5 1,000. He released the button and slid his hand back to its original position, palms flat against the roof. The entire sequence had taken less than 10 seconds. It was a small, silent act of rebellion, a digital flare shot into the sky that only his allies could see. A profound sense of relief washed over him, quickly followed by a new kind of tension. The clock was now ticking. He didn't know the average response time for a silent alarm on a command-level officer. 10 minutes? 15? It felt like a lifetime. Now his job was no longer just to de-escalate, it was to survive. He had to keep these two volatile, unpredictable officers occupied and relatively calm until help arrived. He had successfully called for backup. Now he just had to live long enough to see them. The destructive rhythm of the search continued, but now there was a desperate edge to it. Miller, having found nothing incriminating in the main cabin, moved to the cargo area with a renewed, frustrated vigor. He unzipped the largest piece of luggage in the back, a black, heavily padded tactical bag. "Danny, you better come look at this," Miller called out, his voice a strange mix of excitement and confusion. The use of his partner's first name was a break in protocol, a sign that what he'd found was unusual. Calloway, whose name was apparently Daniel, kept his eyes on Elijah for a moment longer before turning and walking to the rear of the Tahoe. Elijah risked a slight turn of his head, just enough to see what was happening. Miller had pulled out the contents of the bag, and they were now laid out on the floor of the cargo area. Inside was a neatly folded tactical vest with a large, empty Velcro patch on the front and back where identification plates would go. Next to it was a secondary sidearm, holstered and secured in a locked case, a backup weapon Elijah was licensed to carry but rarely did. There was also a set of professional-grade handcuffs, several loaded magazines in a pouch, and a portable radio identical to the ones used by the Trinity County Sheriff's Department. For any trained law enforcement officer, this collection of items should have been a screeching halt, a giant flashing sign that their initial assessment of the situation was catastrophically wrong. This was not the random assortment of a criminal, it was the carefully curated equipment of a professional. A reasonable officer would have paused, taken a step back, and started asking very different questions. But Daniel Calloway was not a reasonable officer. He was an officer operating on a powerful dose of confirmation bias. He saw what he wanted to see. "Well, well, well," Calloway said, a slow, triumphant grin spreading across his face. "Look what we have here. A police impersonator. This is a felony, you know that?" He looked at Elijah, his eyes gleaming with a sick kind of pride. He believed he had cracked the case. The hoodie, the nice SUV, the calm demeanor. In his mind, it all now made sense. This was a sophisticated criminal, and he was the sharp, intuitive cop who had brought him down. "That is my issued gear," Elijah said, his voice cold and hard as steel. The time for placating them was over. The signal was sent. Now he just had to hold on. "Every single item in that bag is registered to me and logged with the Trinity County Sheriff's Department." Miller looked uneasy. He picked up the radio, turning it over in his hands. He recognized the model. He had one just like it in his own patrol car. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. "Danny," he started, his voice hesitant. "What?" Calloway snapped, his good mood instantly evaporating. "Don't tell me you're getting soft. This guy is a phony. We got him." "It's just..." "This is high-end stuff. The real deal," Miller mumbled, looking from the gear to Elijah and back again. The pieces of the puzzle were right in front of him, but he couldn't bring himself to put them together because the resulting picture was too terrifying to contemplate. Calloway, however, was doubling down. His ego was too invested to admit a mistake. He reached into the bag and pulled out a heavy-duty county-issued medical kit. He unzipped it and began pulling out the contents: tourniquets, chest seals, pressure dressings. "See this?" Calloway said, holding up a packet of Quick Clot. "This is what cops carry. He probably stole it from a patrol car. We're going to put you away for a long time." He was so focused on building his false narrative, so blinded by his own prejudice, that he missed the most important item in the bag. It lay at the very bottom, tucked into a side pocket, almost hidden from view. But Elijah knew it was there. It was the first glimmer of the truth, waiting patiently to be discovered. It was a simple, leather-bound portfolio, and inside it was a sheaf of papers. Papers that detailed patrol schedules, deputy assignments, and department memos. And on the cover, embossed in simple gold lettering, were the words, "Deputy Sheriff Elijah Vance, Trinity County." They hadn't found it yet, but they would. The truth had a way of making itself known, often at the worst possible moment for those trying to deny it. Just as Calloway was triumphantly cataloging the stolen gear, the dynamic on the lonely stretch of highway began to change. A silver sedan, which had been approaching from the opposite direction, slowed down dramatically as it neared the scene. This wasn't the usual rubbernecking, the momentary glance of a curious driver. The car slowed to a crawl, and Elijah could clearly see the driver. A woman in her 40s with a determined set to her jaw. In her hand, held up and pointed directly at them, was a cell phone. The small, dark lens was an unblinking eye, capturing everything. Elijah pressed against his vehicle, the two aggressive officers, the contents of his life strewn about the back of his Tahoe. "Hey!" Calloway shouted, his head snapping toward the car. "Keep moving! Nothing to see here!" The woman didn't move. She brought her car to a complete stop in the opposite lane. There was no other traffic. She rolled down her passenger side window, the phone still held high. "Is there a problem, officers?" she called out, her voice clear and steady. "Does he need help?" Her question was a carefully worded challenge. She wasn't accusing them of anything, but she was making her presence known. She was a witness, a third party, and she was recording. The effect on Calloway and Miller was immediate. Their body language shifted. Miller took a half step back from the Tahoe's open door, a flicker of anxiety crossing his face. He was suddenly aware of how this looked from the outside. Calloway, however, reacted with anger. His authority was being questioned, not just by the man he had detained, but by a random citizen. "Ma'am, this is an active police situation," Calloway yelled, taking a few aggressive steps toward the center line. "You need to clear the area now or you'll be obstructing an investigation." The woman didn't flinch. "I'm on a public road, officer. I'm just making sure everyone is safe." The advent of the smartphone camera had changed policing forever. Every stop was now a potential stage, every citizen a potential director. For good cops, it was a non-issue. For cops like Calloway, it was a threat. The official narrative, the one he would write in his report, was now being challenged in real time by an objective, visual record he couldn't control. He was caught in a dilemma. Continuing to engage with the woman would mean turning his back on Elijah. Ignoring her meant allowing her to continue recording, to create evidence that could be used against them. He chose to bluster. "I'm not going to tell you again! Move your vehicle!" Behind him, Elijah remained perfectly still, but inside, a small measure of hope began to bloom. The woman was a game changer. She was an independent witness who could corroborate his story. Her presence might even be enough to temper the officers' aggression, to force them to think twice before escalating further. The standoff with the woman lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, with a last defiant look, she put her car in gear and began to slowly drive away. But she kept the phone pointed out the window until she was well down the road. The immediate threat of her presence was gone, but the impact lingered. The officers knew they had been recorded. The encounter seemed to shake something loose in Miller. He was visibly rattled. "Danny," he said, his voice low and urgent, "let's just run his plates and ID and wrap this up. People are watching." "We wrap it up when I say we wrap it up," Calloway seethed, his face flushed with anger. He stalked back toward the Tahoe, his frustration making him even more reckless. He was losing control of the situation, and it was making him dangerous. He plunged his hands back into the tactical bag, yanking things out with a renewed fury, determined to find the ultimate piece of evidence that would prove him right. He was no longer just searching for a crime. He was searching for a way to salvage his own ego. And in his haste, his hand closed around the one thing he should have looked for first. Calloway's frustration had reached its peak. The citizen with the camera had unnerved him, and his partner's wavering confidence was eroding his own. He needed a win. He needed the smoking gun that would validate every decision he had made since pulling the Tahoe over. He plunged his hand deep into a side compartment of the gym bag on the passenger seat, a place Miller had only given a cursory glance. His fingers brushed against something smooth and cool. Leather. He pulled it out. It was a black leather trifold wallet, thicker and heavier than a civilian one. It wasn't Elijah's personal wallet, that was still sitting on the dashboard. This was something else. With a sense of impending triumph, Calloway flipped it open. The afternoon sun caught the polished silver first. It was a 5-point star, intricately detailed and mounted on a circular background. It was heavy, official, and utterly unmistakable. Beneath it, engraved in bold, clear letters on a curved silver ribbon, were the words, Deputy Sheriff. And below that, on a smaller rectangular plate, Trinity County. For a moment, Calloway's brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing. It was a state of cognitive dissonance, a violent collision between his deeply held assumption and the irrefutable reality in his hands. He stared at the badge, his knuckles white as he gripped the leather. His triumphant smirk faltered, melted, and then vanished completely, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated shock. He instinctively flipped to the other side of the wallet. There, behind a clear plastic window, was the photo ID. It was a picture of the man currently spread-eagled against the side of the SUV, but he wasn't wearing a hoodie. He was in a crisp, decorated Class A uniform. And under the photo, the text was stark, official, and damning. Vance, Elijah S., Deputy Sheriff, Second in Command, Trinity County Sheriff's Department. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The chirping of the cicadas, the distant hum of the highway, the very heat of the sun, it all receded into a dull, roaring background noise in Calloway's ears. The man he had pulled over, threatened, insulted, and manhandled was not a car thief. He was not a police impersonator. He was the second highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the entire county. "Danny?" Miller asked, his voice laced with concern. He had seen his partner freeze, had seen the color drain from his face. "What is it? What did you find?" Calloway didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had constricted, his lungs suddenly void of air. He looked from the ID in his hand to the back of Elijah's head. The man he had called a county worker in a tone of utter contempt was, in fact, his superior in almost every conceivable way. In rank, in jurisdiction, in experience. He had just conducted an illegal stop and an unlawful search on his own command. No, not his command, the command of a neighboring and now deeply offended agency. He slowly, mechanically lowered the hand holding the badge. He felt a tremor start in his fingers and spread up his arm. He looked at Miller, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror. "Miller," he choked out, his voice a hoarse whisper he barely recognized as his own. "We have a problem. A very, very big problem." Elijah, still pressed against the car, heard the shift in tone. He saw the sudden, absolute stillness in Calloway's posture. He didn't have to see the badge, he knew. The truth was finally out of the bag. The first part of his ordeal was over, but he knew, with a grim certainty, that the second part was just about to begin. The lie had been told. Now the consequences were coming. The silence that fell over the scene was heavier and more oppressive than the afternoon heat. It was a vacuum, sucking all the bluster and aggression out of the air, leaving only a cold, terrifying clarity. Officer Miller, seeing the look on his partner's face, stepped closer and peered down at the credentials in Calloway's trembling hand. Miller's reaction was even more visceral. His jaw dropped and he took an involuntary step backward, stumbling slightly on the uneven gravel. He looked as if he'd been physically struck. "Oh, no," he whispered, the words barely audible. "No, no, no!" He put a hand to his forehead, his eyes darting wildly between the ID, his partner, and the man still standing calmly against the Tahoe. The power dynamic on that roadside had not just shifted, it had inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. Moments before, Calloway and Miller were the embodiment of state-sanctioned authority, holding total power over a presumed suspect. Now, they were two rogue officers who had just committed a career-ending and potentially criminal act against a high-ranking official. They were no longer the hunters, they were the prey, and the consequences of their actions were bearing down on them like a freight train. Calloway finally found his voice, but it was a pathetic, cracked version of his former confident bark. "Sir," he began, addressing Elijah's back. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding." Elijah didn't move. He didn't turn around. He didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing his face. He let the weight of their catastrophic error settle on them, let them stew in the toxic juices of their own prejudice. "A misunderstanding," he said, his voice quiet but carrying with the force of a judge's gavel. "It seems to me you understood exactly what you wanted to understand, officer." The use of the word officer was a deliberate twist of the knife. He was using their title, but it no longer sounded like a term of respect. It sounded like an accusation. Miller began to panic openly. "We didn't know. Sir, we swear we had no idea who you were," he pleaded, his voice high and strained. He started gathering the items he had thrown on the ground and in the car, his movements frantic and clumsy, as if trying to physically undo the violation he had just committed. "You had my license on the dashboard from the very beginning," Elijah stated, his voice still unnervingly calm. "You had my registration. You had my word. None of it was good enough for you. Why is that?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable because the true answer was too ugly to admit. They didn't believe him because they had looked at him and seen a stereotype, not a man. Calloway, seemingly paralyzed by the magnitude of his mistake, was still holding the badge and ID. He looked like a child caught with his hand in a cookie jar, holding the evidence of his transgression with a look of stunned disbelief. The foundations of his professional world had just crumbled to dust beneath his feet. Every step of the encounter replayed in his mind, but now each action was cast in a new, horrifying light. The baseless stop, the aggressive commands, the illegal search, the smug insults. It was a litany of failure, a step-by-step guide on how to destroy a career in law enforcement in under 15 minutes. And just as the reality of their situation was reaching its nadir, a new sound began to intrude upon their private nightmare. It was faint at first, a distant, almost imperceptible cry on the horizon, but it was growing louder with terrifying speed. It was the sound of sirens, multiple sirens approaching fast. For Elijah, it was the sound of cavalry. For Calloway and Miller, it was the sound of judgment. The wail of the sirens grew from a faint hum to a multi-toned, overlapping chorus of urgency. It wasn't the sound of a single patrol car responding to a routine call. This was the sound of a significant response, a full-scale mobilization. It was the sound every cop recognizes with a primal jolt. Something serious has gone down. Calloway and Miller froze, their faces a canvas of dawning horror. They looked at each other, and in that shared glance a terrible understanding passed between them. The sirens weren't coming for the suspect they had detained. The sirens were coming for them. The silent alarm. The man they had pinned against the car had, at some point during the encounter, called for backup without them even realizing it. The knowledge that he had been that in control, that far ahead of them, while they were blustering and threatening, was another layer of humiliation. Elijah finally decided it was time. He slowly pushed himself off the roof of his SUV and turned to face them. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his face calm, but his eyes as hard and unforgiving as granite. He simply stood there, watching them as the sirens grew to a deafening crescendo. The first Trinity County Sheriff's Department cruiser appeared over the rise in the highway, its lights flashing a frantic, synchronized rhythm. It was moving at a speed far exceeding the legal limit, eating up the asphalt. Close behind it were two more, and then a fourth. They were descending on the scene like birds of prey, a swarm of brown and white vehicles that represented an entirely different world of authority. The lead car, a slick-top Charger, skidded to a halt at a sharp angle behind the Northwood patrol car, creating a roadblock. The doors flew open before the car had even fully stopped. Sergeant Frank Davies, a burly, gray-haired veteran with a face like a clenched fist, emerged from the driver's side, his sidearm already drawn and held in a low-ready position. His partner did the same on the other side. Davies' eyes, trained by 30 years of sizing up threats in a split second, swept the scene. He saw the Northwood car. He saw Calloway and Miller looking pale and terrified. And then he saw his boss, Deputy Sheriff Elijah Vance, standing calmly beside his personal vehicle, his off-duty clothes slightly disheveled. The relief on Davies' face was immediate, quickly replaced by a dark, thunderous rage. "Elijah, you okay?" he yelled, his voice a gravelly roar that cut through the sound of the sirens. "I'm fine, Frank," Elijah called back, his voice steady. That was all Davies needed to hear. He holstered his weapon, his focus now shifting entirely to Calloway and Miller. The other deputies were pouring out of their vehicles now, forming a semicircle, their expressions a mixture of confusion, shock, and dawning anger as they pieced together what had happened. They saw their second-in-command, off duty, clearly being detained by officers from another jurisdiction. The air crackled with tension, the unspoken loyalty of a department manifesting as a wall of silent, intimidating presence. Calloway, still holding Elijah's credentials like a hot coal, took a weak, stumbling step forward. "Sergeant," he began, his voice cracking, "we can explain." Davies strode toward him, his expression utterly devoid of sympathy. He was not in the mood for explanations. He was in the mood for answers. "You can explain why you had my deputy sheriff pulled over and spread-eagled on the side of the road?" he growled, his voice dangerously low. "This had better be the best damn explanation I've ever heard in my life." The approaching sirens, which had seemed so loud moments before, were now just background noise. The real storm had just arrived. Calloway and Miller were no longer just two cops who had made a mistake. They were two outsiders who had, in the eyes of the Trinity County Sheriff's Department, assaulted one of their own. And the department was now standing right in front of them, demanding an accounting. The scene on the highway shoulder had transformed into a tense tableau of departmental jurisdiction and loyalty. On one side stood Calloway and Miller, isolated and exposed, the crisp blue of their Northwood PD uniforms suddenly looking flimsy and out of place. On the other side stood a growing number of Trinity County deputies, a sea of brown and tan, their collective gaze a palpable force of anger and judgment. They were a family, and these two officers had just laid hands on one of their most respected members. Sergeant Davies stopped directly in front of Calloway, his sheer physical presence overwhelming. Calloway, who had seemed so tall and imposing to Elijah moments ago, now looked small and insignificant. "Let me see it," Davies commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Numbly, Calloway handed over Elijah's badge and ID. Davies took it, glanced at it with a familiarity that confirmed its authenticity, and then tucked it safely into his own pocket. "I'll hold on to this for you, deputy," he said to Elijah, a gesture of both respect and protection. He then turned his full, undivided attention back to Calloway. "I'm going to ask you one time, officer. What was your probable cause for this stop?" Calloway's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The flimsy excuses that had seemed so powerful when directed at a lone civilian now crumbled to dust under the withering stare of a seasoned sergeant. We believed the vehicle was suspicious," he stammered. "Suspicious how?" Davies pressed, his voice like grinding stone. "Was it speeding? Weaving? Did it have a broken taillight? Or was it just a nice SUV being driven by a black man in a county you don't even patrol?" The question was a rhetorical bomb, and it landed with devastating accuracy. Calloway flinched as if he'd been slapped. One of the younger deputies, a man Elijah had personally mentored, stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. His voice was trembling with rage. "You pulled over our deputy like he's a common criminal? Do you have any idea who this man is?" The possessive pronoun, "our deputy," was key. It wasn't about rank or procedure anymore. It was personal. It was an insult to their entire department. Miller, who had been trying to make himself invisible, decided to speak, a desperate attempt at damage control. "With all due respect, Sergeant, we were just doing our job. We made a mistake." "A mistake?" Davies spun on him, his eyes blazing. "A mistake is writing the wrong date on a report. A mistake is forgetting to refuel your cruiser. What you did here was conduct an illegal, bias-based stop. You unlawfully detained a citizen who happens to be a command-level officer. Then you conducted an illegal search of his vehicle. You didn't make a mistake, son. You took a match to the rule book and your own careers." While Davies was delivering his verbal beatdown, another vehicle arrived. It was a black, unmarked Ford Explorer that pulled up slowly and parked behind Davies' Charger. The man who stepped out was tall and lean, with short... He then turned and his calm, assessing gaze fell upon Calloway and Miller. The full weight of the law in Trinity County was now looking directly at them. "Sergeant Davies," the sheriff said, his voice deceptively mild. "Please secure these two officers. I believe Internal Affairs is going to want to have a very long conversation with them." Sheriff Brody's words landed with the finality of a prison door slamming shut. The command to secure the officers was unambiguous. It meant they were no longer being questioned. They were being officially detained. The color, which had already drained from Calloway's face, seemed to vanish entirely, leaving a pale, waxy sheen of sweat. Miller looked like he was about to be physically ill. Sergeant Davies nodded curtly. "My pleasure, Sheriff." He turned to Calloway and Miller, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. "You heard him. Turn around. Hands behind your back." The two Northwood officers hesitated for a fraction of a second, a final, futile moment of disbelief. Their training, their instincts, their entire professional identity screamed that this was wrong. They were the ones who put handcuffs on people, not the other way around. But the authority in the sheriff's voice and the unyielding wall of deputies surrounding them left no room for defiance. Slowly, mechanically, they turned to face the Northwood patrol car. Davies expertly and impersonally patted Calloway down for weapons, removing his sidearm, taser, and spare magazines with practiced efficiency, placing them on the hood of the car. Another senior deputy did the same for Miller. The act of being disarmed was a profound humiliation, a stripping of the very symbols of their power and identity. They were no longer police officers, they were suspects. As Davies prepared to cuff him, Calloway made one last, desperate appeal, his voice cracking. "Sheriff Brody, sir, please." It was a procedural error, a misidentification. "We apologize for the inconvenience to Deputy Vance." Sheriff Brody, who had been speaking quietly with Elijah, turned his head slowly. He fixed Calloway with a look of cold disappointment. "Officer," he said, his voice level and dangerously calm. "Inconvenience is when you get a flat tire. Inconvenience is when your lunch order is wrong. What you did here today was not an inconvenience. You used the color of law to harass a man based on your own prejudices. You violated his civil rights. You escalated a situation that should never have happened. And you dishonored the badge you both wear. The only procedural error I see is that you were ever given a badge in the first place." The sheriff's words were a clinical, brutal dissection of their failure, leaving no room for excuses. He then turned his back on them, a clear dismissal, and resumed his conversation with Elijah, effectively ending any possibility of appeal. The judgment had been rendered. Davies pulled out his handcuffs. The metallic ratchet sound as he secured the first cuff around Calloway's wrist was shockingly loud in the tense atmosphere. It was the sound of a career ending, the sound of a line being irrevocably crossed. Miller flinched as he heard it, and a moment later felt the cold steel close around his own wrists. The other Trinity County deputies watched in silence, their anger now tempered by a grim sense of solemnity. This was not a moment of triumph. It was a tragedy for the profession. They were witnessing the necessary but ugly process of the system policing itself. They saw in Calloway and Miller a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how quickly ego and prejudice could lead to ruin. The woman who had recorded the incident earlier had evidently called it in. As the two disgraced officers stood cuffed, a Northwood PD supervisor's vehicle arrived, its lights off. A captain stepped out, his face a mask of grim resignation. He had clearly been briefed by his dispatch. He walked directly to Sheriff Brody, his expression deeply apologetic. "Sheriff," the captain began, "on behalf of the Northwood Police Department, Brody held up a hand, stopping him. "Save it, Captain," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Right now, my only concern is my deputy. Your department and mine will have a long talk later. You can have your car back. But your officers," he said, gesturing to the cuffed men, "are coming with us. They are material witnesses in an internal affairs investigation, a Trinity County investigation." The message was clear. This was their jurisdiction now. The judgment would be swift, and it would be delivered by them. The metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed across the highway shoulder, a sharp, definitive sound that sealed the fate of Officers Calloway and Miller. They stood, heads bowed, as Sergeant Davies checked the cuffs for tightness, his movements professional and detached. There was no anger left in him, only a cold, procedural efficiency. The fury of the initial confrontation had given way to the grim mechanics of accountability. Sheriff Brody instructed one of his deputies, "Get their information. We'll transfer custody to IA as soon as they're processed at our facility." He then turned to the Northwood captain who stood by, looking helpless and mortified. "Captain, I expect your full and unconditional cooperation with our investigation. Body camera footage, dash cam footage, personnel files, everything." "You'll have it, Sheriff. Whatever you need," the captain replied quickly, his tone deferential. He knew his department was in a position of extreme vulnerability. The actions of his two officers had created a major diplomatic and legal incident. The Trinity County deputies began to efficiently dismantle the scene. Two of them methodically photographed the interior of Elijah's Tahoe, documenting the disarray left by the illegal search. Another deputy collected Calloway and Miller's firearms and equipment, bagging them as evidence. The process was a mirror image of a crime scene investigation, only this time the suspects were wearing police uniforms. Elijah watched it all unfold with a sense of profound detachment. He felt no satisfaction in seeing the two men cuffed. He felt no joy in their downfall. All he felt was a deep, bone-weary sadness. Sadness for the profession he loved, sadness for the public trust that was eroded by incidents like this, and sadness that in the 21st century, the color of his skin could still be mistaken for probable cause. Sergeant Davies and another deputy led Calloway and Miller to the back of a patrol car. As they passed Elijah, Calloway, his face pale and drawn, stopped. "Deputy Vance," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I am truly sorry." Elijah looked at him, not with anger, but with a piercing, analytical gaze. He was trying to see beyond the uniform, beyond the mistake, to the man inside. What he saw was a man terrified of the consequences, a man whose apology was born of fear, not of genuine remorse for the prejudice that had driven his actions. Before Elijah could respond, Sheriff Brody stepped in, his voice low but firm. "He has nothing to say to you, officer. Save your apologies for your hearing." The words were a shield, protecting Elijah from having to engage further with the men who had wronged him. Davies gently guided Calloway into the back of the cruiser. Miller followed without a word, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. The door shut with a heavy thud, sealing them inside. As the cruiser prepared to pull away, Elijah finally spoke, not to the officers, but to the closed door of the car. "Your oath," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It's supposed to mean something." Sheriff Brody placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "To men like you, Eli, it does. That's what matters." The convoy of Trinity County vehicles began to depart, leaving only Elijah, Sheriff Brody, and Sergeant Davies on the now quiet roadside. The Northwood captain got into his own vehicle and drove away, back to the firestorm that was surely erupting in his department. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the asphalt. The oppressive heat of the afternoon was starting to break. Elijah walked back to his Tahoe and looked at the mess inside, the scattered papers, the overturned equipment. It was a tangible representation of the chaos that had been injected into his day. With a sigh, he began to slowly, methodically put his life back in order. The roadside was quiet now, the frantic energy replaced by a somber calm. The last of the cruisers had departed, taking with it the wreckage of two careers. All that remained was the evidence of the encounter, the scuff marks in the gravel, the lingering tension in the air, and the disarray inside Elijah's Tahoe. Sergeant Davies, after a final quiet word with Elijah, got into his own vehicle and drove off, leaving the deputy sheriff alone with his boss. Sheriff Brody leaned against the side of the Tahoe, his arms crossed, watching as Elijah carefully replaced the items in his medical kit. For a long time, neither man spoke. There was a shared understanding between them that required no words, a bond forged over years of facing down chaos together. Finally, Brody broke the silence. "You handled that with a level of restraint I'm not sure I would have been capable of, Eli." Elijah paused, a pressure dressing in his hand. He looked at the familiar, life-saving item and thought about how it had been twisted into something sinister in Calloway's eyes. "My training kicked in, I guess," he said, his voice flat. "Treat every encounter as potentially lethal. De-escalate. Survive." He looked up, his eyes meeting the sheriff's. "The tragic part is, I had to use that training on two men who are supposed to be on my side." "They were never on your side," Brody said, his voice hard. "They were on the side of their own ego and their own prejudice. There's a difference." Elijah closed the kit and placed it back in its spot. He leaned back against the seat, the exhaustion of the day finally washing over him, heavier than any physical fatigue. He looked out at the peaceful landscape, the golden fields stretching to the horizon. It was the world he had sworn to protect, but today he had needed protection from his protectors. "I keep thinking," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what would have happened if I didn't have that badge in my bag? What if I was just a guy in a hoodie driving home from his construction job? Would I be in the back of that cruiser right now, on my way to jail for impersonating an officer or some other trumped-up charge?" The question was rhetorical, and the unspoken answer was a cold, ugly thing that sat between them. Brody's expression was grim. "It shouldn't matter who you are. A citizen's rights are not contingent on their job title. What they did was wrong, period, and they will be held accountable. I give you my word on that." Elijah nodded slowly. He believed him. Brody was a good man, a fair man, but the problem felt so much bigger than two bad cops. It was a sickness, a deep-seated distrust that turned a simple interaction into a life-or-death confrontation. He finally stood up, closing the rear door of the Tahoe. He turned to face the sheriff, his expression clear and resolute. The weary victim was gone, replaced once more by the second in command. "I was thinking about something Calloway said. He felt so powerful, so sure of himself. He thought his badge made him right." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "He was wrong. The badge doesn't make me safe. My rank doesn't make me safe. Following the rules didn't even make me safe." He looked Sheriff Brody directly in the eye, his voice filled with a quiet, unshakable conviction. "The truth does. The only reason I'm standing here, and they're in the back of that car, is because the truth finally came out." The statement was profound in its simplicity. It was the ultimate lesson of the day's brutal ordeal. Power wasn't in the gun or the badge. It was in the unassailable weight of reality. And today, reality had hit two Northwood police officers like a brick wall. Brody nodded, a look of deep respect in his eyes. "You're a good man, Elijah, and a damn fine cop. Go home to your family." Elijah got into his car. The interior was still a mess, but it felt like his space again. He started the engine, took a deep breath, and pulled back onto the highway. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. It was a beautiful end to an ugly day. As he drove, he knew this incident would change him. It would leave a scar, but it would also serve as a permanent reminder of the principle that guided his entire life, both in and out of uniform. The truth is the only authority that can never be questioned. As we reflect on what happened on that lonely stretch of Highway 84, it's easy to focus on the dramatic conclusion, the arrival of the sirens, the click of the handcuffs. But the real story lies in the quiet, terrifying moments that came before. To understand how to prevent this, we have to understand the psychology that created it. Officer Calloway wasn't just a bad cop. He was a product of fear, ego, and a dangerous cognitive bias. He likely saw the world through a lens of us versus them, where anyone who didn't look or act like him was a potential threat. When he saw Elijah, he didn't see a man driving home. He saw a symbol that challenged his worldview. A black man in a vehicle he couldn't afford, in a place he didn't belong. Every calm, intelligent response from Elijah was not seen as de-escalation, but as defiance, further fueling Calloway's need to assert dominance and be proven right. His actions weren't born from a desire to protect and serve, but from a desperate need to control a situation that only existed in his prejudiced mind. What could have been done differently? If Elijah had reacted with the anger and frustration he was rightfully feeling, the outcome could have been tragic. His discipline and training saved his life. But should the burden of survival rest solely on the victim's ability to remain perfectly calm in the face of injustice? Of course not. If the system had been stronger, perhaps Calloway's history of minor complaints would have been seen as a pattern, a red flag addressed long before he was in a position to ruin someone's life. If our culture didn't perpetuate these harmful stereotypes, perhaps Calloway would never have seen a threat in the first place. The solution isn't just about punishing bad apples, it's about examining the health of the entire tree. This story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about aggression or dominance. It's found in quiet dignity, in unwavering professionalism, and in the courage to trust the truth, even when you are surrounded by lies. Elijah's victory wasn't when those officers were cuffed. It was in every single moment he refused to let their prejudice define him. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What part of the story resonated with you the most? Do you believe the consequences for the officers were appropriate for their actions? Let us know in the comments below, and please subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of justice.